My name is Vivian Hart, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. I welcome you today to our voter education program. We hold 6 voter education programs throughout the year, and this is one of our important ones also. When 2 jobs are not enough, wealth and income disparity. Very interesting topic, and one that's really important for this time in our society's history. I'd like to introduce the co-chair of the committee that put this together, Mary Elizabeth Holler.
Well, I'm pretty excited. But before going into the introduction of our speakers on income and wealth disparity, our program, When 2 Jobs Are Not Enough, has also been variously promoted as When 2 Incomes Aren't Enough, When 2 Paychecks Aren't Enough, and might as well have said When 2 College Degrees Are Not Enough. And all of these really get to the heart of the issue. Here in the U.S. of A., in Pima County, and in Tucson, you can play by the rules, go to college, be a good citizen, work hard, and yet never be more than 1 paycheck away from financial disaster. So disparity is not an abstract issue. It affects us all. And today we are going to take a look at how we got here and the costs. Some of those costs are personal, some are political. There are social costs fraying the fabric of our society. And there is a real dollar price tag attached. So we are looking at our speakers today to address the issue in numbers, the demographics, and to put some human faces and experiences to it. So our first panelist is Price Fishback. He's the Thomas R. Brown Professor of Economics at the University of Arizona and is a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is the author of several books in his field, the latest, Well Worth Saving, How the New Deal Safeguarded Homeownership. And he will be followed by Jim Kaiser. He is former page editor of the editorial page for the Arizona Star, and he did that for what, 11 years?
11 years.
And he is the author of a recently completed research paper, Opportunity in Tucson. And I would recommend, if this topic interests you and you have the time, it is well worth reading. After retirement from the Star, Jim also worked on an as-needed basis for the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. And I think this will bring smiles to a number of us here who support the League's work in environmental issues and education. He is also a co-founder of the Southern Arizona Buffalo Grass Coordination Center. So we appreciate that. And then certainly, I hate to say this is so trite, but it's so true. Last but not least is VanHook, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of the nonprofit Habitat for Humanity in Tucson. And she has spent more than 20 years working with community-based human services, neighborhood housing, and nonprofits. She currently serves on several committees and boards in the realm of affordable housing. And one of those is Humanity's International Policy Committee. She is also one of 2 American Champions for Habitat Bangladesh and works with international partners through Solid Ground to influence policy and support safe housing around the globe. And now I want to introduce Deborah Wallace, who is our moderator, and she is going to guide us through this program. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. My name is Debbie Wallace, and we now have the pleasure and privilege of hearing from our 4 very distinguished panel members. After we hear all of the presentations, we'll then have audience questions. You'll find cards and pencils are placed on all the seats. So as we're listening to the presentations, if you have a question, please write it down on the card, raise your hand, and the card will be picked up. And if you have a question for a particular panel member, please specify that on your card. So let's begin. This is the really exciting part. We will turn to our first speaker. The floor now belongs to you, Dr. Price Fishback.
Thank you. So thank you for coming out today, and also thank you very much for allowing me to come speak. My research is about economic history, so I'm an economic historian, so a lot of this is what talks about historical trends. So one of the issues you face in all these various things is that being one paycheck away from disaster is actually kind of the human experience for a very long period of time. So I have a kind of more positive message about what's going on than you usually read in the press, but there's still plenty of problems to worry about, as there always are, because life is hard. And so the question is how do you overcome that, and how do you make things better? So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about growth in per capita income, just to kind of give a sense of how the standard of living has changed over the last 50 or 100 years, and just to give a feeling for how things have gone over time. Then I'm going to talk about the top 1%. There's been a lot of talk about the 1% versus the 99%. There's some controversy developing in the economics literature about the measures of this, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. I don't know what the actual result is, because this is a new controversy that's developed within the last 6 months. I'm going to talk about the bottom fifth and how they're faring, the middle fifth, they're kind of the median group. Then I'm going to make some international comparisons, and I'm going to talk about public assistance, and finally I'm going to talk about international social welfare spending, and I compare the way the U.S. deals with things compared to the way the Nordic countries do, because they're always kind of the social democrats that everybody points to. So a lot of this stuff tends to be historical, so I apologize for not having the latest up-to-date stuff. Most of these trends or whatever kind of have followed through even in the last few years. I just didn't have time to put the numbers on. So here's real GDP per capita, and I like to point at things, so I'm going to go back there and do that. So what I want to point out to you is that, this is 1790 and that's 1960, but you can see per capita GDP has been rising relatively rapidly. So not like China, but China is at only $10,000 per person, and we're at 60,000. So it's a lot easier to grow fast when you're at 10,000, particularly in terms of percentage terms. But here's the Great Depression. So you can see this was a huge drop off at the time, but look how quickly we dominated it and we've gone on before. And then you can see the Great Recession up there as the drop before. One thing I'd like to point out is that the Great Recession drop is nothing like this. If you actually look at the actual percentages of GDP, that was a 30% drop in GDP during the Great Depression. So one thing I can tell you about is I'm an expert on, well, kind of an expert on the Great Depression and the New Deal. So I am a leading indicator of whether or not people are worried about recessions. And so no one's calling me right now. So this is good news. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an idea of what, a lot of times you see those numbers, what do they mean? I mean, what's going on? Well, this gives you an idea of the hours of work for an average person, the average manufacturing worker at the time, for how long it takes them to buy all sorts of different things. I'm not going to go through this whole table, but basically I wanted to point out, like a clothes washer, when 1919 it cost you 553 hours of work. These days it costs you 26 hours of work to do this. And actually it's probably lower than that, because clothes washer, the clothes washer thing has stayed relatively flat in terms of prices while incomes have gone up some. And so you go through and there's a long list. The only things that have seemed to have gone up in price are actually a women's haircut, movie tickets, and particularly education, or at least college degrees. So I teach in college, so I understand that. We need to do better on that. And then this gives you an idea of the share of households with durables. So you can look at telephones. I mean, 35% had a telephone in 1919. It's at 95% now. And everybody seems to have a cell phone now. So, I mean, this stops in 2000, but there are tremendous changes that have gone on. And then you look at probability of having a computer. No one up to all the way to 1995. Your cell phone's basically a computer now. So almost everybody's got a computer. So there are dramatic changes over time and these kind of things. There are also other changes happening. Life expectancy has risen dramatically over time. This has just white females and white males, just to give a comparison. So the black figures are actually a little bit lower than that, but they've been rising at a slightly faster trend. Infant deaths, have dropped off enormously. We don't do as well as some of the European countries, although they do things a little bit differently. So the gap between us is actually smaller than you usually see. Suicides have stayed relatively flat. Despite all this material wealth, you look at the happiness measures and no one seems to be any happier. So I guess it's just based on expectations. There are all sorts of psychological things you can get into. Hire a psychologist to come in and talk to you about that. Now, one of the big things that's going on is healthcare expenditures have risen dramatically over time, but mostly a lot of that has to do with the fact that we can do so much more for people than we could before. And so, I'll point out some of those things in a moment. And then the share of the population with degrees is quite high. Now, I haven't really put this on the slides, but a driving force for inequality in the last 25 to 30 years has been how the rising demand relative supply of highly educated people, and then the relatively low growth in demand and the same supply for low-income people, for people with less skills. And so education turns out to be huge in terms of determining where you are on that income distribution. And so there's a book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz that points these kind of things out. Okay, so much of the new changes, you'd think that things would slow down some, and they have a little bit. Okay, but we're still growing at about 1.3% per year. Since 1940, per capita income has grown at 1.6% per year over the long haul, including the Great Depression and all those other kind of things. Another thing to point out is, in terms of recessions, we have had four out of the 6 longest expansions in American history since 1984. So there's it's amazing. It used to be every 3 to 5 to 7 years there was a recession, but we've somehow been avoiding recessions. I'm not sure how. I don't think anybody really knows for sure how we've been doing it. But this is a pretty amazing story. This expansion has been growing slower than prior expansions, but it's still been growing at about 1.3, 1.4% per year. Okay, but a lot of the changes don't actually show up in those growth numbers. Improved electronics, eliminating pollution. The air pollution from automobiles is 3% of what it was in the 1970s. And so people think about this, they don't realize just how special that's changed. We've actually just shifted our focus to different kinds of pollution during these time frames. So we can always find problems to work on because things are not perfect. And so that's one of the things to consider. Improve workplace safety and improve safety in all sorts of other dimensions. Just think about what your automobile looks like compared to what it looked like when you were growing up. Seat belts, when I was growing up, I was standing in the front seat, on top of the steering wheel, doing all sorts of stuff. I was doing gymnastics, in these things. Improved healthcare, we're spending a huge amount on healthcare, but they're doing amazing medical feats. My sister just had a hip replacement. She was out of the hospital within 3 hours. She has a scar that's like this big, and she was walking up and down stairs immediately. Can you imagine being able to do that? 20 years ago, you couldn't do that at all. And new cancer therapies, organ transplants, a lot of focus on reduced pain and shortened recovery times. Of course, that kind of came with a problem with the opioid epidemic that's happened. And so sometimes things don't go quite the way we expect them to. So here's the big worry that everybody talks about. This is what the session's about. It's about inequality. This is Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman, and they've become relatively famous for pointing these kind of things out over a very long time frame. And so you can see, as we went through the World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, inequality dropped quite a bit in terms of this measure, flattened out for quite some time, and then it's risen relatively rapidly according to their statistics starting in 1980. And a lot of that is timed to when CEO pay started going up. Primarily, the CEO pay is rising not so much because their base salary has risen. It's because of all the various positive benefits that they give them and all these things, and they don't really have a downside for most of these guys on what happens if things go badly. And so what happens is there's a lot of churn at the top, because it depends on when you pull out your stock options and use them as to whether you're going to be in the top 1% that year, and then you drop back out again. Now, the reason I said there's a controversy about this is a couple of guys who are working in the government have been doing some stuff, and they have access to some better data than what Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman had. And so what the key difference between the data that they have is they know much more about unreported income than the other guys did. The other guys had to assume the same fixed percentage, and they used that percentage all the way through the distribution on how much was being unreported. what these guys had access to, Otten and Splinter had access to, was the actual audits of all sorts of different people. And so they could actually take into account what the differences in the audits would be. So they have a much better picture of what the unreported income looks like. And as you can see, instead of the share of GDP going to the top 1% rising from 11 to 20, according to Otten and Splinter, it's gone from 9 to 15. Now, usually when these things happen, you have some kind of big battle. So the battle has just begun, so we don't really know what the thing is, but it raises some doubts about what Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman have said. And the reason that's so important is that they've been pushing very strongly to tax the upper 1% very highly, and also the 1%'s wealth and things like this. And they've been doing this over and over these graphs, and so that you know, if you really need to think about these carefully in these kind of cases. And now the other thing is, there's always been a big battle of what was happening after taxes and transfers, and Otten and Splinter have a much more detailed analysis of that. And so they actually find it's relatively flat, whereas what the other guys find is that it's a substantial rise in that kind of situation. So as I said, I don't know what the final truth is, because I haven't been able to spend a lot of time looking at it pretty carefully. Usually what happens is you have these big fights, and they usually end up in the middle. So, okay, so here's the share of consumption and income that's going to the top quintile. This is the top quintile. This is the top fifth of the distribution. And you can see that in terms of income, at the first thing here, this is pre-tax income. So you can see the blue line is pre-tax income at the top. There's a really big rise in their share. If you look at consumption, which is, let's see, which one's consumption? Consumption is this one. They don't seem to be getting as big a share as they did before. So consumption's taking out the savings and all sorts of things along those lines. Now, savings are particularly important, but consumption is a good way of seeing where people are at a particular point in time, particularly for low-income people whose income fluctuates a lot. Because a lot of time you end up consuming more than what you actually earn in a variety of different ways, and so you really want to look at consumption as kind of the long-term situation where people are. Okay, so Bruce Meyer, who's at the University of Chicago's Public Policy School, and Jim Sullivan, who's at Notre Dame, have been doing a huge amount of work on comparing poverty rates and things like this, but also taking into account what happens to poverty rates after you control for household size and also after taxes and transfers. Okay, and so these guys have seemed to be doing the best work. So Bruce got his degree at MIT, same place where Saez got his. And James got his at Northwestern, which is another major economics department. So you can see the official poverty rate. The official poverty rate is this red line. Okay, now this is before taxes and transfers, and so you can see in 1963 it was as high as 31%, and it's been dropping. Wait a second, I'm sorry, it's the blue line is the official poverty rate. So this one's been bouncing around between 11 and 19% since 1963. So the red line is what's been done after you take into account household size, because it turns out that low-income households tend to be smaller than high-income households. And the other thing is you take into account after-tax money income and after-tax and transfers, and what you see is it drops from 31% all the way down to 8%. So they actually have a paper where they argue we've been winning the war on poverty. Now, we can't say that for sure for the following reason. They're all basing it on surveys. Now the problem is the very poor are people who often are missing on surveys. And so they're falling through the cracks in something, and so we don't really know what's going on with the extreme poor. We see destitution in various places around Tucson and around the country. And so they're not being picked up by these statistics. Now the good thing about these statistics is that they at least give you an idea of, within the realm of what we can collect information on, what the trends have been over a long period of time. So, but you realize that, people who are living on the street aren't filling out surveys. Okay, so these are consumption levels, and this is why they say we won, is we ended up down, if you look at what the final measure that they used, we ended up at actually a 3% poverty rate. The differences between these are all based on different measures of the CPI, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But basically, there's been a downward trend in consumption poverty over time. Now, here's another way of measuring where you are relative to incomes, and that is the fraction who are below 50% of the median income in the economy. Okay, and so this line up here is money income, and as you can see, it goes from like 18 to 23. If you look at after-tax money income and after-tax income plus non-cash benefits, it's rising from 15 to 18. this is after adding the non-cash benefits, and so there was a big surge in non-cash benefits after this. But you look at consumption, and it's much flatter than those kind of things. It's still dropping, but it's not dropping nearly as fast. Or, yeah, the share is dropping, but it's not dropping nearly as fast. Okay, and then this is the share of overall income. So you can tell that consumption is flat at 9%. The post-tax and transfers has been dropping over time from 5 to 3.5. So it's not as negative as what you usually read in the newspaper, but it's still a downward trend for what their shares of income are looking like in these kind of cases. Okay, and then the top group has been grabbing more of a share of income over time. And as you can see this, the blue line here is the pre-tax income. I wanted to have all the lines be the same colors in the right spot, but you know, just Word and Excel and those kind of PowerPoint just doesn't seem to want to agree in these kind of things, okay? And so this is after tax, and then this is well-measured consumption. And so what you see is when you're looking at consumption, you're looking after tax and transfers, it doesn't look as bad as what you would think. There's still rises in their share, though, in these kind of things. Okay, so here's the bottom 20. Now, instead of just looking at the income numbers, they actually, what Bruce and those guys did, was they also looked at, you know, what's kind of happening over time for various features of the housing you're living in. Like, do you have central air conditioning? In 1981, the bottom fifth, only 15% had central air. By the time you get to 2009 and 2015, it's over half the people. And so you can see various measures here. I should have brought handouts so you could keep them. Clothes dryers, all sorts of things along these lines are improving. The number of rooms in the unit per person is going up quite a bit. And so or actually not quite a bit, from 1.3 to 1.4. Square footage is rising some. So things have been getting better, but not at a rapid rate. Okay, so here's the annual average growth rate in real consumption. Now, here's where the CPI has become a big issue. Macroeconomists in the mid-1990s argued that what was happening was the CPI was overestimating inflation by about 1% per year, each year. And the reason was differences in the quality of the goods that are being provided. Now, in the 2000s, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has tried to fix that problem. Okay, but they've managed to fix it and eliminate some of the problem. But just think about the quality of things that you're looking at. Think about the quality of the TV you watched 20 years ago and the quality of the TV that you're watching today. Think about the quality of the phone that you have now and how it compared over time. Think about the quality of what they can do in healthcare. A lot of those things just do not get measured, and so that's what they're trying to take into account. So I'm giving you the kind of the range. So the bottom, if you look at the incomes, I know this is consumption, real consumption. Real consumption for the people from 5 to 20% has grown about 0.56% per year, which is much slower than the average. Okay, but it's been, I thought I had 20 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. You showed me 1 minute. Oh, right, okay, I see. Okay, so the adjusted CPI was, if you adjust the CPI for those adjustments, it's 1.37%, which is about the average of what everybody's doing. I'm not sure about this. A lot of people have been talking about doing this in different ways. That just gives you the range of where I think things would be. Okay, so the biggest people is people falling through the cracks. And one of the biggest things, we have surprisingly low take-up rates for a lot of different programs. And why? It could be underground activity. People are trying to avoid being associated with government in some way. It could be stigma, associated with social stigma. It could be applying is too complicated. I mean, sometimes you fill out these forms and you can't find the right office. We have like 50 or 60 different programs. And it doesn't seem to be a really great centralized office to get all these things done. And so, do we make it difficult on purpose? I don't know. Are we just not very efficient at helping the poor? That's another question as well. And then you have the problem with finding the people who are not in the surveys. And those are the people I'm most worried about. So how have the middle fared? They've done okay, kind of middling, not as fast as they should have been. I'm going to skip over that because I want to talk about what we do for the poor. So one of the things you have to realize is the United States has 51 public assistance programs. It's not one, it's 51. So if you look at TANF, which is what we call welfare, and you look at supplemental security income, which is what we do for the elderly, the rates, the benefit levels are determined at the state level, and they have a wide range of these different things. Now, there's another thing that's really hard to find, actually, if you look at the statistics. And I wrote a paper and a presidential address about this for the Economic History Association, is trying to find out what the target minimum is that they're trying to provide. Because most of these states have in mind, I'm going to get people to a certain level. When you look at the spending on welfare, the spending per person, a lot of times what that's doing is filling a gap. Here's a target income level you're trying to hit. This person's earning 50% of that, so we're going to fill the gap of 50%. So the spending is not really telling you what they're doing in terms of what level of income they're trying to provide you. Okay, and it turns out that finding the official statistics, what that target is, it's there, but you have to dig really deeply. And they seem to hide it for some reason I don't understand. So what I did was I tried to put together numbers. I did this for the 20th century, so I did this yesterday for 2010. For TANF, plus Medicaid, plus SNAP, which is food stamps, plus other food like school lunches, and WIC. And then I also did it for supplemental security income, which is what we do for the very poor elderly. So the target benefits for public assistance, I assumed a family of 3. Now note, we're starting with someone who has no income, so I can actually get what's the target they're trying to put them at. Okay, and then the benefits are what we described there. So here's what you find here. So the mean, if I population weighted mean, so I'm looking at the mean United States, you look at everything that we do for the poor except for housing and for electricity and things like that, puts you at about 84% of the poverty line. That's where they're trying to get those people to. Now that's the mean for the country as a whole, but I want you to notice how big the range is. It goes from 1.22 in New Mexico, surprisingly, down to 0.63, which is in Hawaii. Now, these don't necessarily jive with what you would normally think about because I adjusted for cost of living across all the states. There's enormous range in cost of living differences. So, like New York's cost of living is 37% higher than Arkansas's. And it's 26% higher than Arizona's. And so there's enormous range that's going on in there. So I've adjusted for those kind of things, so it's not the typical relationship. Now that's for the family of 3. But look how much better we treat the elderly. For the elderly, it's 2.61 is the mean, and the range is 4.4 to 1.9. Now, a lot of that has to do with medical spending, so I separated that out. As you can see, the medical spending accounts for like 1.6 of the 2.61, whereas the payments for food and non-medical stuff is only 0.98. And it's about 40% of what's going on for the TANF family of 3. But I really want to emphasize just the enormous range that you see across the country, because people make these comparisons between the United States and the rest of the world, and they're comparing one number for the United States when the United States public policy thing is much more diverse than probably the rest of the world combined in a lot of these cases. Okay, so I'm out of time, so let me go to the very end, and I just want to summarize there's 2 things. That the top end stuff that's been so controversial over the last 10 years is coming under fire right now, and so we need to learn a lot more about what's going on. Same thing happened with the minimum wage in the 1990s. And so it's going to take a while for that to balance out. So I'm expecting it to be not quite as bad as what Piketty Sayas and Yuckman say, but probably not as good as what Otten and Splinter say. And then the bottom 5th or whatever, they're kind of bouncing along, but you have to worry about, in terms of the bottom 5th, we're still not getting at the people who fall through the cracks, and they're not in the surveys. We actually do quite a bit of stuff. I had a bunch of comparisons for international stuff, but I'm out of time. So, thank you.
That gives us a lot of food for thought. I'm glad there's no exam today. Thank you very much, Dr. Fishback. And we will now turn to our next speaker, and the floor belongs to you, Mr. Jim Kaiser.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today and pleased that I have this opportunity to talk with you. I want to talk to you about opportunity in Tucson, or actually a little bit more accurately, I want to talk about the lack of opportunity in Tucson. But Price gave you a very optimistic view, maybe not very optimistic, but somewhat optimistic. I'm going to give you a fairly negative view. Let's see if I can figure out how to work this. I want to convince you of 3 things today if you don't already believe them. One is that financially, Tucson is not a good place to grow up. Tucson lacks opportunity for its young people, and what opportunity is here is not equally available to everybody, especially to those who need it the most. The second thing is lack of opportunity, poverty, and inequality are all closely interconnected, and they come together when you're dealing with people of low incomes. And third, I believe that most effective solutions are going to come from changing public policy and corporate policy to reduce the causes of poverty and lack of opportunity. By opportunity, this is a graph that gives you a sense of what I mean by opportunity. In 1940, more than 90% of kids who were born in that year could plan on making more money than their parents did. By 1985, over on the right, it had reduced to about 50% of the kids who were born that year could plan on making more money than their parents did. And this is a measure of upward mobility, or the lack of upward mobility, and how well children do in relation to their parents is a pretty a reasonable proxy for opportunity, and more broadly, children's earnings as they grow up is an indication of how much opportunity they've had. The research is based on, that I'm going to present to you, is based on a Harvard economist and the U.S. Census Bureau. They used millions of de-identified tax returns to track 20 million children as they grew up and to see how well they were doing. And 25,000 of these children were in Tucson. So I think the Tucson numbers are probably pretty meaningful. Here's how Tucson compares to the nation in terms of, if a child grows up in Tucson for 20 years, how does he grow up to the national median for other kids? And what it tells you, these numbers are actually red over here on the right, and what they're telling you is that a child who grows up in Tucson, whether it's low, median, or high-income parents, will be earning $4,000 to $5,000 to $6,000 per year less than the median. The economic researchers at Eller College compare Tucson to 11 other cities, and so I chose those 11 cities as well to look at how low-income, middle-income, and high-income parents compare, kids who grew up with low-income, high-income, and middle-income parents compared to kids who grew up with the same level of household income in those other cities. And where you see black numbers, that means that the kid who grows up in Tucson is earning more than the kid who grew up in the other city. And where you see red numbers, it means that the kid who grew up in Tucson is earning that much less per year than kids who grew up in other cities, which is an indication of significantly less opportunity in Tucson than in these cities. Within Tucson, economic opportunity varies sharply. What this is a graph of boys and girls who grew up in Tucson, how much money they are making in adulthood. It's not where they grew up, but it's how much money they're making. It's not where they live currently, it's how much money they're making in adulthood and where they did grow up. The blue and the green on the top are higher than the median for this area. The red and the orange down below are lower than the median for this area. The darker the blue, the higher the income. The darker the red, the lower the income. This is the same map, and what it really shows is at the top of the map where you have all the blue and the green, you can get a sense that Tucson is really economically segregated. The well-to-do and the wealthy tend to live north of River Road and Rito River. There's a lot of problems with economic segregation, but one of the worst is that when you have the well-to-do and wealthy off living by themselves, they don't necessarily understand the lives and the problems facing everybody else. And it's especially bad for kids who grow up with kids like themselves who don't understand other kids. I wanted to take a more detailed look at Tucson, and this has a lot of things going on to it. The top third shows kids who grow up in households with low incomes. In the middle, kids who grow up in households with middle incomes, and kids who grow up in households with high incomes. And every single number, a kid who grew up in a low-income household in adulthood makes less than a kid who grew up in a middle household income. And a kid who grew up in a middle household income makes less than a kid who grew up in a high household income. So the parental income is a very important determinant of how much money a kid is going to earn when he grows up or she grows up. It also divides boys to girls, and you'll see that there is a very substantial difference there on all three income levels. Gender makes a big difference. And within each level, I've looked at race and ethnicity, and they're huge. There's a very large difference by race and ethnicity, especially for the boys. Now, if parental income, gender, and your race or ethnicity has a lot to do with how much money you're going to be able to earn when you grow up, then the question is, we believe in equality of opportunity, but if those things determine how well you're going to do, we don't really have equality of opportunity, in my opinion. When you have a large number, a significant number of people with less of opportunity, you're going to have more poverty. Tucson, on this chart, is the second from the bottom. Poverty in 2017 was 18.3%, higher than 10 of the other 11 cities that the researchers compared Tucson to. We all know that poverty is hard on people, but it's also costly to the economy as well. I don't know of anybody who's calculated the cost of poverty in Tucson, but I do know that 7 Canadian provinces calculated the cost of poverty and then related it to the gross domestic product. And it ranged between 4 and 7%, or an average of about 5.6%. So if you take that 5.6% and apply it to Tucson's gross domestic product, what you get is that poverty is costing Tucson about $2.2 billion per year in terms of economic activity. Question is it going to get better or is it going to get worse? The chart on the left, Tucson is a top line, and it shows that it has increased from the year 2000 to 2017 up to 18.3%. And has gone up a little bit faster than the nation and about even with Arizona. The table on the right, the graph on the right, Tucson is on the bottom. It shows you that kids who are under 18, 25.8% live in poverty now. And if people who live in poverty tend to grow up and live in poverty, that's not a very good sign. The bottom, female-headed households, no male present, with kids under 5, have a poverty rate of 39.8%. These are all University of Arizona economic and business research center statistics. I heard a presentation last week by George Hammond of the Economic and Business Center, who says that in the next decade or so, 40% of the jobs in Pima County are going to be affected by automation. Now, they're not all going to be, it's not all the jobs are going to disappear, but they're going to be very largely dislocated. There'll be different jobs, and maybe jobs will disappear as well, I don't know. But poverty is not going to get better, it's going to get worse. What to do? I think we need to accept we have a serious problem. I think we need to recognize also that while economic growth is desirable and is really good, bringing in new companies with high-paying salaries is really good for keeping our college graduates here, it probably will do nothing for those who are in poverty. And the reason I say that is based on what happened in Charlotte, North Carolina. They, between 2004 and 2013, they had one of the very fast growing economies, creating jobs fastest among the fastest growing cities in the country. But at the end of that period of time, researchers looked at the ability of poor children to move up the economic ladder, and they found that Charlotte was 50th among the 50 largest cities at the bottom. So the reason new good jobs were going to the middle and upper middle class and to new residents coming in, but not to the poor. But one way to help kids is by increasing their parents' incomes. And doing that is associated with a child having better health, more schooling, more hours worked, and higher wages in adulthood. The federal earned income tax credit lifts millions of families out of poverty. Consequently, many states, I believe it's 28 states, have created their own earned income tax credit. If you want to guess, Arizona is not one of those. And I think it should at least be considering that. Minimum wages help, but the federal minimum wage is a very little help. When you adjust it for inflation, the federal minimum wage was the very highest in 1968. Is now, when it was in buying power, it was $11.55. Is now at $7.25. Arizona's minimum wage is pretty good. It's $12, high among the other states. MIT has a living wage calculator on a website that says that in Arizona, one adult without any children, the living wage is $11.68. So the minimum wage would cover that person. However, one adult with one child, they say the living wage is $24.56, twice the minimum wage in Arizona. To help kids improve their schools, we certainly need to put money into preschool, and we all should be supporting the preschool promise. We all know that Arizona ranks very low in funding of public schools, and I've been curious whether that's because we can't afford to spend more. And so I found a U.S. Census Bureau report that pointed out school funding in relation to personal income in the state, which is a measure to me of affordability. And when you look at that, Arizona is second from the bottom. So we can afford, I believe we could afford to be spending a lot more based on that. If we were to raise Arizona's spending just to the national average, it would take up school funding by 40%. Well, neighborhoods are important. If a kid grows up in a mixed income neighborhood, they will likely have more opportunity than a kid who grows up in a poverty neighborhood. So we should do what we can to create mixed income neighborhoods. Seattle has a program to do this with housing vouchers. Reduce inequality, I know it's easy to say that, but at a minimum, we should not make it worse. We should resist any efforts to save money by weakening the social safety net, and we should resist any efforts to raise taxes that affect the poor most strongly, and specifically sales taxes. And we can organize, we can do as Charlotte did, try to figure out what's going on and to better understand opportunity and poverty and to recommend ways to increase them. Finally, I'm suggesting higher wages and I'm implying higher taxes. And the question, who's going to pay them? And my solution to that is you and we should be happy to be doing that. We should be willing to spend a little bit more money on things we buy in order to ensure that the workers can make a better salary. We should be willing to spend a little bit more on taxes to ensure that schools are better funded. And I think that we need to acknowledge that we all who are doing pretty well, and I'm assuming you all are doing pretty well, need to make sure that we are not being complicit in keeping other people from doing better. Thank you.
Mr. Kaiser, and putting everything, the big picture in local terms is always especially eye-opening on a personal level. And we now turn to our next speaker. The floor belongs to you, Ms. T. VanHook.
Good morning. I don't usually do slides because we try not to turn human beings into poster children. So I want to start by thanking you for inviting me and then giving everyone something to reflect on. We are all here. It's an assumption, but by looking at the crowd, I can kind of make it. We are all here because we had a safe, decent place to sleep last night. And that cannot be said for 1 in 5 children in Tucson today. So if we reflect on that, all of the things that we're able to do, get up and get ready for work and socialize with friends, create neighborhoods and community networks, is really based on having someplace safe and stable to stay. And in Tucson, that's not a reality for many people. I often say that we've gotten here, and I was telling Price I need to follow these two all the time when I speak because I don't have to throw out the numbers. But we got to this place with this heat map that shows that people of wealth and property live in one place, people without those live in another, and we have an extremely divided community through a big history. 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but not equal, and we're living in a period of what some may call racist housing policies where we grant funds through government agencies in areas that are less desirable. You know, you get extra points for federal funding if you're not near a grocery store, if there is poor infrastructure, if there are high concentrations of poverty. So we continue to perpetuate the systems of poverty in the community, and that becomes a real issue. Jim just showed us that when you come from a low-income family, you live in a low-income neighborhood, your opportunities are far more restricted. Without the stability of housing, without being able to create those social networks, it's not impossible, but it's a struggle. There's a great opportunity for families to move forward. It was interesting, Dr. Fishback, because we're seeing an opposite trend in that low-income families that are coming through our program and our fellow programs are larger than we've seen in many, many years. Right now, I'd say in Habitat's 40-year history, we're seeing the largest families that we've ever seen. And we've gone to building larger, although not giant, square-foot houses. We're building 5-bedroom houses right now. We have 3 families with 9 household members or more in our program. And part of that is because we're back to a system of multi-generational families living together to survive. Adult siblings bringing their children together to live in one household so that they can have that stability. People will say that millennials don't want to buy a house. They don't want to have stability. They want to move from area to area, be able to choose jobs. That's very true for middle to upper class children. When you talk about low-income families, that stability, that idea of hopping around by choice, does not exist. You know, I like to say that we are all equally privileged and equally impoverished. And right now in Tucson, maybe you're privileged of spirit and impoverished of goods, and just the opposite. Everyone has talents, and right now in our community, the gap is growing. When Habitat Tucson was founded 40 years ago by some amazing community members coming together, if you had a minimum wage job and you put your entire salary to purchasing the median home-priced home in Tucson, you had to work roughly 22 years to pay the mortgage for the median cost of a home. Right now, 2 people working full-time in minimum wage jobs, it's 46 years. Wow. So the gap between the cost of safe, decent housing and the wages is widening greatly. The Urban Land Institute, and I shared with my colleagues this morning a research paper that came out recently, is showing that gap is widening and widening. Those who are able to afford housing are increasingly the numbers are increasingly diminishing. Home ownership, or decent home ownership, is declining. Right now in Tucson, it's estimated that about 55,000 houses are substandard with people living in them. The elderly, families that can't afford repairs. The preservation of housing is equally important to making housing available, and the programs here are very limited in doing that. We see that there are a number of issues that are involved in this. Number one, land use. Land use is a huge issue. It was brought up earlier. If we don't want to have mixed income neighborhoods, if we want to stay segregated, we will never have stability. Neighborhoods of opportunity. We're building job centers in this community. There are concentrations of low-income jobs, the resort industry, call centers, distribution centers. They're all located in areas in Tucson without accessibility to the working folks at that wage level. Not only are there no houses built around the Ritz-Carlton or the Star Pass Marriott or any of the others, there's also no transportation there. None of the public transportation reaches those job centers where the low-wage jobs are, creating a further issue. The less we integrate housing for every level of income, the more unstable we become. It's Janet Napolitano, when she was governor, used to talk about the time tax as things, housing prices were going up in 2002, 2004. The cheaper the house, the further you had to drive to get to where you work. And so that created a lot of stress on our infrastructure, streets and roads. It created a lot of congestion. It created a lot of other problems that are associated with those economic factors. I love the statistics that he gave on longevity, but more than your genetic code, your zip code, or the median income where you live is a far higher determinant of health outcomes than any other factor. If you have stable housing, you are more likely, you're 70 times more likely to survive a major illness than you are if you do not have safe, decent housing. Children's attendance rates in schools drop dramatically in lower income concentrated areas because they don't have safe, decent places to live. You take your 4-year-old who's had an asthma attack to the emergency room. We have public programs that will help in that emergency. They take the medications. You go home and there's dust, there's not solid walls, there's mold in your home, all of those other things. All the medication in the world is not going to help a 4-year-old with asthma if they don't have stable living conditions. So, are there answers? I would say there are many things that we can do. Land use reform and looking at how we direct those, how we direct land use, and how we think about our community and planning. Number 2, availability of financing. 97% of the housing built in this country over the last 20 years has been built through the Internal Revenue Services incentives rather than the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if you look at that, and that's a historic trend that goes on, I'm not quite sure when the tax deduction for your mortgage interest started. We all know it ended last year. But if you think about it, everybody took that as an incentive. It's an incentive to have a mortgage, even if you could pay cash for your house, because you get a reduction in your taxes. People thought that was great. Those same folks that took advantage of that, when you look at something that goes to a low-income family, it's a subsidy. I bet not very many people who took that tax deduction thought of themselves as living in subsidized federal housing, right? But when you do grant funding for subsidized federal housing, you lock people into place and with restrictions that are make it almost impossible to increase their economic future as they grow. So let me give you an example. I'll give you a local example. Right now, the city of Tucson had an impact fee waiver for low-income families. So if you're building housing, apartments or housing that's going to be occupied, like in Habitat's case, by someone that makes 80% of the area median income or lower, you could apply for a waiver for impact fees. And it was a great incentive for us. It was about $7,000 a house, which when you're trying to build, right now we have 26 under construction times $7,000, it's a significant savings for building affordable housing. Last year, they changed that rule. They rewrote the ordinance on the waivers. And now, for that $7,000 waiver, they want to put a 25-year restriction on the house for resale. The house would have to go back to another low-income family at an affordable rate, or the family has to pay back the $7,000. So the builder gets the incentive now to build the house. The family has a 15-year obligation to stay there. When we look at low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, and opportunity zones, they're amazing opportunities for home builders to build housing for low-income folks. The problem is the compliance periods, the strings that are attached, the fact that you can't go into a mixed income neighborhood because the folks that are already there have too high a wage profile. Their household incomes are too high for you to place any type of mixed use housing within those neighborhoods. We're putting poverty with poverty, creating enclaves, and increasing the hot map that we saw earlier about income. I love this statistic. You had the one up on women and wages, women in poverty. According to the university's MAP project, a woman in a household with children under the age of 18, single woman, and a single man in a household with children under the age of 18 have a $22,000 a year disparity in median income. So when you add up the cost of living, childcare, food, all of these other factors, you just keep digging, and you're digging deeper and deeper and deeper into generational poverty. Housing has been the way that most American families have climbed up the socioeconomic ladder. Equity in people's homes pay for educations. Equity in people's homes pay for elder care when they're older. You know, how many of us have a relative or know someone who's been able to sell their house because it was fully paid for and then afford to go into an assisted living program? Take a mortgage on the house because your child was accepted to medical school. These are all simple factors that many people take for granted. But when you live in generational poverty and you've never owned land, you've never owned a home, you don't build that equity or have the ability to slowly move your family up that economic ladder over generations. It is a critical factor. So we're not talking about the homeless. Homeless issues are in and of themselves are giant issues. But just the integration of mixed use housing to address some of the other issues that were just talked about. I bet it would surprise you if I told you that there are neighborhoods in Tucson that still have in their CC&Rs that people of color cannot live there. Let me repeat that. There are neighborhoods in Tucson whose CC&Rs state that people of color cannot live there. Now, is that enforceable? No. But has it changed? No. We still see very specific populations living in neighborhoods, sometimes by choice, which is just lovely, and sometimes because it's the only place that they can find someone to rent to them or a place that they can afford. In the case of many of the families that we're working with, native-born refugees, folks that have immigrated here, all across the demographics, those family sizes become a critical issue. I love that Price discussed that the uncountable. Because if you were to fill out on your 2-bedroom apartment application that you had 11 family members that were going to live in that apartment, they would return the application to you and laugh. So there's this secret underground kind of economy where people are really scraping out survivability by banding together and flying under the radar. And it's a critical issue that needs to end. So really, I think there are land use, the ability to finance both the organization or the company that is going to build the affordable housing projects, a critical issue, and the availability of financing to families that don't have perfect credit and are living in poverty, a way for them to purchase or live in a safe, stable apartment. supply and preservation of existing housing. Right now, there are a number of apartment complexes, 22 or 23 in Tucson, who have been built with new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, or money from the American Affordability and whatever it was Act, Recovery and Affordability Act. Those houses have a compliance period for the dollars. More than 1/3 of those housing units will have that compliance lifted in the next 4 years, and the ability to condominiumize or to go to market rents. That's 1/3 of the existing rental housing in Tucson will have the ability to convert to market rate. It's a pretty staggering number. This is the first time where we are seeing, in my career, and it's more like 30 years than 20, but that's okay. I like the old bio.
You started when you were 5.
I was 5. Yeah, I'm hurt that I was invited to the under 40 thing. Let me put on my glasses here. But right now we're seeing a whole generation of folks who were junior high, high school, when their parents lost their homes in 2008, 2009, and they do not have any stability as far as backing. You know, they maybe leveraged themselves to $40,000, $50,000, $70,000 in college debt, thinking that they're going to come out and get a job that is a magic bullet, that they're going to have some place to live, that they're going to have the new car, and those things do not exist. We don't have the wage centers in Tucson to support that. Statistics are that 1 in 7 children in Arizona don't have what they call safe, decent place to live. So that means a couple of things. They're in foster care, they're living on the street, or their parents are paying more than 50% of their total income on basic housing needs. 50% of their income on basic housing needs. It's estimated in Arizona that 70% of the residents may be paying 50% or more for rent and a mortgage and the taxes and utilities that go along with that. When HUD set its standards, when the federal government started looking at poverty levels and where subsidies, I like to call them incentives. We incentivize business, but we subsidize human beings. I think we need to start incentivizing human beings. When those parameters were put in place, everything that was discussed is 30% of your income should be spent on housing. So to see the population of folks paying 50% or more is really staggering. Poverty costs in lack of productivity, poverty costs in lack of feeding back into the environment, and it costs families and communities a great deal. We're working right now in Amphi and Flowing Wells. Both were model communities for themselves. I was looking at the city's general plan from 1977, and the boundaries were pretty amazing. Nothing like it is now. And those neighborhoods were both thriving. Right now in Amphi, there's about a 3% home ownership rate. Let me repeat that. In Amphi, there's a 3% home ownership rate, and many of those houses are in need of great repair. At the Amphi High School, 46% of the students are new enrollees every year. That type of mobility for families. Children living below the poverty line attend an average of 13 schools in 10 years. You get the apartment, you get a month free rent, then 6-month lease you're locked in. You're not able to make the rent somewhere in that 6 months. You need to go someplace else. There's an amazing book, Evicted, that shows the economic downfall of already low-income families as they're evicted and moved from house to house, or apartment to apartment to apartment, and the criteria that they're able to meet lowers and lowers and lowers, and takes a good look at what that does to the family structure, and eventually there's nothing left. So the gap is growing. Incentives are depleting. And our problem is increasing. And housing is just the small aspect of it. But if you don't have a decent, safe place to live, if you don't have that place to rest and to eat and to be with family, the rest of everything in your life is affected. And so I just ask you all to really reflect on that, on what that stability means to you. And when it comes time to think about and influence, to keep those factors in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. VanHook. You've shined quite a bright spotlight on how interconnected, interwoven all these details are with housing. It's by being here, you're supporting the voter education program of the League of Women Voters in Tucson, and I think all of us who are members walk away from a situation like this just motivated to really double up our efforts at trying to have an informed public on these extremely vital issues in our community. Thank you. So there's a question for Dr. Price Fishback. Do you see a revival in unionization?
So if you're talking about unionization, private unionization, I think, is probably not going to revive very much. I mean, the primary, since 1955, that's been dropping off quite a bit. One of the biggest reasons, I think, is just the nature of jobs has changed so dramatically. Manufacturing has been declining. We've become much more of a service industry, and service sectors and things like that don't tend to unionize nearly as much. The government has taken over a lot of the roles that unions often played in terms of providing like workers' compensation and all sorts of pensions and things along those lines, and so have companies. Now, where unionization has grown is in the public sector, and so teachers and other public sector unions will probably stay about the same. I don't think unionization is going to change very much, except for in the public sector.
Thank you. And perhaps Ms. VanHook, I don't know if this, what can we do to get the federal earned income tax credit in Arizona? Or Mr. Fisher, would you have an answer to what can we do?
We have the federal tax credit. We just don't have a state income, EITC.
Maybe that's the question. How can we get an earned income tax credit in Arizona?
Simple. You get the legislature and the governor to.
Could you just thank you?
You get the governor and the legislature to do it.
Where's our Senator Bradley? Okay, we'll have to just save that.
Can I make a suggestion on that? So most work about the minimum wage finds that you still find some losses in employment and things like that. And one of the issues is that a lot of people who are getting the minimum wage are not the first earner, they're the second or third earner. So the EITC seems to be a much more effective way of dealing with poverty than the minimum wage is in these contexts. Most economists seem to agree upon that.
Okay, thank you.
Does everybody know what the EITC is? Earned Income Tax Credit? Right, because a lot of people don't realize it's there, but it's pretty powerful.
It's been very effective for lifting people out of poverty.
Yeah. That would be the #1 program I would pick.
Thank you. And here's a question for Ms. VanHook. Please comment on zoning laws and the impact on housing.
Oh wow, this is a big question. In the introduction, she mentioned I work with Common Ground, which is an international movement about land tenure and the use of land around the world. In areas around Washington, D.C., in California, in all but 11 states, there's something called inclusionary zoning. It's specific zoning that allows or gives credit for the development of affordable housing. It's an incentive to build affordable housing. Arizona, is unconstitutional. It was declared unconstitutional by land use. How that zoning works is I take for rezoning a piece of property and I want to go from industrial to residential. In order to make that entitlement change on the property, there are certain conditions. So it may be for this many houses in this price range, you also have to either pay into a trust fund, build houses on your site or in separate sites, so that there's a balance of affordable and market rate housing being built. Right now we don't have that. The cost of entitling property, changing the zoning on it in order to get folks in is huge. There are also some ordinances and zoning laws around putting auxiliary dwelling units in on your existing property to raise additional funds. Yeah, I would say that land use or entitlement of land is one of our biggest and most, it's a large opportunity for us to make change in Arizona.
Thank you. This question is, why did Tucson's poverty rate grow so much in comparison to other Western cities? Is it only because of racism and segregation or bigger minority population?
It's just a general question to anybody.
Yes, it is.
Do you
Maybe.
have an answer?
Oh, actually, I think I have somewhat of an answer. I don't think it's due to racism and stuff. I don't know. So one of the things about this is when you look at the results he suggested and the results I showed you, one of the key differences is you're showing the official property rate, right?
Yes.
And so this is before you have taxes and transfers. So you have to take those into account to get a lot of the statistics that he brought up are actually consistent with the statistics I showed you, because if you look at the official poverty rate, it's been going up for the country as a whole. And so the question is, what happens after you adjust for the taxes and transfers and things along those lines? It turns out that Arizona is actually pretty high in terms of what they give for a family of three in terms of benefits relative to the cost of living. So you also have to adjust for cost of living and to get the difference in the statistics between what Mr. Kaiser and I showed you. But it's just a complicated set of arrangements that are going on. It could be that this is a center for migration, immigration, and things like that. So you have a group of immigrants coming in still, not as many as before. There are a variety of different factors. It just it could be just a temporary rise relative to everybody, what other people are doing.
And would both of you like to comment?
Well, the question is, why did the poverty go up higher? And the simple fact is, I don't know. But
I don't think we know fully. I mean, it just depends on, there are a whole bunch of things I don't have my hands on. George Hammond might have at Deaver and the Eller College might have a lot of statistics that might help you look at that.
Thank you.
Lack of economic diversity.
Lack of economic diversity?
When we have a certain number of economic segments that get hit, it really has a much broader impact in Tucson than cities that have much more diverse
So to keep our question and answer rules of the road fair, thank you, but we're going to just use the questions on the cards. Here's an additional question. What role did urban renewal in Tucson play in our poverty rate?
I didn't hear the question.
The question is, what role did urban renewal in Tucson play in our poverty rate?
Do you know what time frame you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
What time
The
frame?
Tucson renewal was in the urban renewal 60s when all the downtown convention center and so on. But if any of you have comments, or if
Say
there's...
stuff about national.
No, this was Tucson.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. I heard that housing purchases are being, let's see, 80% of housing purchases are being bought by out-of-state investors. What does that do for low-income people?
Well, I can say this. I'm not sure that 80% of the houses in Pima County are being bought by investors. A large number of houses are being bought by investors, and a large number of houses that are continuing to go into foreclosure are. I can tell you we bid on the courthouse stairs for houses that go into foreclosure on occasion so that we can, what we call habitize them, rebuild them, and put them out on the market. We used to be able to, by used to I mean 2015, 16, 17, purchase those houses and in an economic way turn them over. But more and more we're seeing in that situation that there are bidders coming in that are corporations that are buying up those houses and doing them. And there are a lot of people being displaced in apartments for or rental housing based on ownership that isn't Tucson.
Any other? Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Please discuss the gap between the people benefiting from the rising stock markets and those who aren't benefiting, since it's the seemingly great thing about the economy. Anyone like to take that?
I can take that. So there has been this last year has been incredible for stock markets, stock prices, because they've risen on average about 30%. So definitely people who own stocks actually are getting a big benefit from that. So the most amazing thing about the stock market these days and just investments in general is that a much broader range of the American public has ownership of these stocks through pension programs and things along those lines than we did in the past. If you were talking about the stock market crash, say back in 1929, about 2% of the population was being affected. These days, if you have any kind of mutual fund or any kind of thing that's sitting in your pension, you're actually an owner of a lot of these different stocks. So if you don't have those kind of things, you're not in some kind of pension program that's invested, then you're not benefiting from this. And so the stock market, we go through periods of ups and downs. In 2007 and 2008, the stock market lost 55% of its value. And so they're just, this is helping come back. But we're setting records now in the stock market. So this is good news in that regard for people who have access to stocks, particularly for future retirees. Now, there is an improvement in average wages for just about everybody right now. So in terms of real terms, average wages probably went up about 2% last year, probably went up about 1% the prior year. But we went through an extended period where they weren't rising very much at all. So the last couple of years has actually been really good for wages for just about everybody.
Can I ask Price a question?
Sure.
Which is, I think I've read that 50% of Americans do not own stock. Do you know the percentage?
I don't know the exact percentage. So it depends on what you mean by owning stock. Is it a particular...
In mutual funds.
In mutual funds. Is it included in retirement programs and things like that?
That's my impression.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay.
So, but it's a lot better than it used to be.
Mr. Kaiser, did you want to discuss your answer to please discuss the gap between the people who are benefiting and those who aren't?
You mean from the stock
From
market?
the stock market?
Well, my answer would be based on something I think I read, which is 50%, approximately 50% of the people are not invested in the stock market. Now, Price and I just agreed we don't really know for sure.
Yes. Okay.
What information that includes?
Okay. And Ms. VanHook, do you want to add?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on the market. I mean, we know that the housing market is rising along with the generation of wealth because people are able to purchase a home. Those who are generating wealth through the growth in the economy. And wages and housing costs are not rising at the same rate. So it's about 4.5 times the rate that housing costs are rising to the wages. So it's creating a larger gap.
Thank you. Do we have time for the last, or where are we with my timekeepers? We don't have time for Senator Bradley, so I'm sorry. We can take one more question. So this is a general question. Can we trust the government's analysis about income equality, particularly under certain administrations? 6 months is suspicious for the top end. And so if you...
I don't understand.
I'm not too sure, but why don't we just maybe go with the major question. How is it that we can trust an administration's income inequality statistics or analysis?
Well, say about that, actually. So,
How many minutes do we have?
well, no, the statistics that I'm using, I'm using the statistics that they've been reporting for quite some time. I've seen their economists and political scientists, sociologists, social scientists all the way around the board have been using these statistics for a long, long time. There is no sign that the Census Bureau and other people are manipulating these statistics, as far as I can tell. They seem to be consistent over time in all sorts of different ways that you could look at it. I guess you could try to go for private statistics on these things, but the biggest problem these days for collecting survey information is no one wants to fill out a survey because they don't want to even answer their phone most of the time. So these things are collected pretty carefully. This is coming from things like the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey. These are people who are dedicated employees who have been collecting these things very carefully for an extended amount of time. You could hate Trump, you could hate Obama, you could hate Clinton, you could hate Bush. Those guys just aren't affecting these things as far as I can tell. So people manipulate statistics, but I don't see these statistics being manipulated. And like I said, the things that we were talking about, if you look at the official poverty rate, it's consistent with everything that Jim said. So it's just that what happens after you adjust for taxes and transfers. And so that's what I was trying to show you.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question. It points out two different things we heard from two different speakers, so maybe we can resolve it. And it says Dr. Fishback said that low-income houses, households are smaller numbers of people, and Ms. VanHook, that they have more people. And
I'll start with that, and it sort of feeds off of the last question, in that we have reported household sizes, and many of those households may have a family member they're either not counting. We don't think about our great aunt that lives with us because, right, we think about reporting our core family. And the other is that we have an underground sort of network of folks that don't fill out surveys and don't participate based on fear or fear of retribution through policy.
So the statistics that I'm showing you in those kind of things is basically they've been asking the same questions for 45 or 60 years, actually. So the question is that a worse problem now than it was before? I don't know. It depends on how bad things. And we've been in expansion for a long time, so I'm not sure that it's a worse problem now than it was before. But the ratio of numbers of people in the houses have been larger households. Oftentimes, the reason the larger households have more income is because they have more people earning money. And so these are just statistics from millions and millions of observations that are coming in.
And the last question, so is it accurate that high-income households have fewer children?
Not necessarily. That's another factor that's going in there. I was surprised when I saw this, but we've known this for quite some time.
Okay. And I think that when we talk about broad statistics and when we look at anecdotal situations, they are two different things. It may be that larger sized families hit a breaking point and seek services, or have access, more members of the household have more exposure to various programs, to opportunities, and so it may just be a matter of that.
So here's a question. Can you explain what taxes and transfers means and how these factors might differentially affect the top fifth and the bottom fifth?
So what I mean by taxes and transfers are the following. So income taxes, the payroll taxes you pay for Social Security and for Medicaid or Medicare and disability insurance. They include sales taxes. They include property taxes. They include just about anything. So they're asking these people, what are all the various taxes that you're paying? All right, the transfers would include all the various public assistance transfers that I talked about, like the temporary assistance for needy families, supplemental security income for the poor. They would include money that would come in for workers' compensation benefits. They include money that would come in for unemployment insurance, money that would come in for Medicaid, money that would come from housing subsidies, wide variety of different types of things along those lines. And so these are like household-oriented things. And so when they're trying to make this adjustment, you have what's going on in the official statistic, which is just what's your money income. Okay, And so that's a first cut at how much money are you earning. And so, but another thing you want to look at is what's going on after you make the taxes and transfers, because that's another part of the story as well. And people actually make decisions about how much they're going to work based on what's going on in terms of transfers as well. And so you really want to have both pictures. What that's saying is that we're not, if you look at the pre-tax and transfer, that's saying, okay, what are you earning in the economy and the market and things like this? And then the post-tax and transfer is saying, well, how much are we actually managed to get you back up to where you should, where we'd like to see you, or where you may be better off after you take into account the taxes and transfers. So one of the things is, like income taxes, for example, probably less than 50% of households now pay income taxes. They still pay Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes and disability insurance taxes. But if you look at the Nordic country, and we don't tax benefits very much for the poor. Most of the taxes they pay are sales taxes. If you look at the Nordic countries, they tax the incomes all the way down. As a matter of fact, they don't tax at the top very much. They actually stopped taxing at the top because they were losing all companies. So Sweden was worried about losing IKEA and Saab and all these other people, so they actually have eliminated a lot of the taxes at the very top. But they tax all the way through the distribution, much more so than we do.
Do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Yes.
There's a new book out called The Triumph of Injustice by two of the economists that Price mentioned. And one of their arguments is that the top 400 families in America pay less in taxes than any other income group.
That's what Otten and Splinter are finding, is that's not true.
They're disagreeing with that.
Disagreeing with that.
Okay.
Now, I don't know about the 400, but they're talking about all these other, they gone into much more detail on what's going on than they do. That's what the dispute's about.
Thank you. Well, that was a lot of information to digest. Thank you so much for your generous time, for your expertise, for your handouts, for this extraordinary morning. And once again, thank you for being part of our program and supporting the League of Women Voters of Tucson.